Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Payal Vaidya. I'm the chair of the ISSIP Service Design Speaker Series. Today we have Anna-Sophie, Thomas, and Josina. I hope I pronounced your name right. With us, and they're gonna share their research and insights on designing for the future of empathy in healthcare. And this is such a timely topic, and I'm glad all of you could make it here. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat channel as we progress. We'll read out the questions towards the end. So we have kept 15 minutes for Q&A. And so I'm going to hand it over to the speakers. Josina, please take it forward. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Payal. It's great that thank you for having us and hosting this and arranging the series. Our plan for the next 30 minutes is to be fairly dialogic between the three of us. So we're going to try and engage in some juicy issues and maybe some things that are different levels of provocativeness and just kind of see where things go. And so we're absolutely open to having perspectives from participants come forward or challenge us back and extend the dialogue with you. None of us think we have all the answers or have it all figured out on this topic. We're just kind of explorers and interested in this space and have some experiences and stories that we're going to share. So to give you a bit of context about who we are, I'll just start with myself and then we'll each introduce ourselves. My name's Josina Vink, and I'm currently an associate professor of service design at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, mainly working in the field of healthcare, doing research around how to transform service systems in health and care. And I have experience kind of for the last 10 years working as a service and systems designer, mainly in Canada and the US. So that's a little bit of my background. Maybe Tomas, can you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Tomas Edman. I'm from Sweden, Karlstad, West Sweden. I am not a researcher, but I work within healthcare since a few years back in trying to implement service design as a method and tool into what we do. So I work in a regional public healthcare system in Värmland, a part of Sweden, where we some 7 years ago started something we called Experio Lab, which is an embedded design lab embedded within healthcare, where we try to create service innovation by design together with patients and staff. And what also happened in those 7 years that we've been running is that it's spread all over Sweden. So now it's actually a collaboration of 7 regional healthcare systems trying to build that capacity together, and I am facilitating that.
Thanks, Thomas. Anna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Anna-Sophie Oertzen, and I'm currently in sunny Munich here. And I'm working at the intersection of research, design, and strategy. So I just finished my PhD at Maastricht University. Yeah, it was last week. So, and at the same time, I'm a service designer, so I'm working on service design projects, and I'm now employed as a strategic innovation consultant at Salesforce, which is an international provider of cloud-based applications. But I'm here today on a private capacity, so just on the research part.
Perfect, thank you. And huge congratulations on your newly minted PhD, super cool.
Thank you.
All right, so let's kind of jump right in. And I will start with just reading a quote from a fairly foundational piece of research that's been done around medical schools, just to open up the conversation here about empathy and healthcare a little bit. And then I'll ask Anna and Thomas a little bit for some of your perspectives. So I wonder about, do you think that there's a lack of empathy right now in healthcare? So let me just read you a quote from this study, a study that's coming out of Philadelphia in 2009. It's pretty highly cited. So a significant decline in empathy occurs during the 3rd year of medical school. it's ironic that the erosion of empathy occurs during a time when the curriculum is shifting toward patient care activities. This is when empathy is most essential. So of course, this is a US-based study, particularly in Philadelphia, and it's particularly around kind of physicians and things like that. Do you see a lack of empathy in healthcare among healthcare personnel, or what do you think the issue is around empathy in healthcare right now? Who wants to chime in first? Maybe Tomas, can you, what's your reaction?
I was sort of assuming that would go to me. I think there are different answers to that. My sort of quickest response, absolutely not. I have met and know so many healthcare professionals that work with patients on a daily basis. And especially in these days, where I can see them doing everything to reach out to these patients and to do everything for them. So I think in sort of the delivery of healthcare on the floor, the empathy is absolutely there. So I think the question rather goes sort of the level of management and organization of the system, where I think maybe that's where we're losing empathy. I can see a lot of maybe frustrated first line staff that somewhat is bereaved, is that the right word, of their empathy or their possibility to be empathic for the people they meet. So I think on a system level, we are absolutely lacking it. And especially I think if we see healthcare also trying to achieve health, where it's sort of obvious if you look to create value of health through the eye of the patient or our own eyes, it's sort of obvious also that we need not only the healthcare system to be able to achieve that, we also need other both public and private systems to be able to achieve that, and sort of they are disconnected, so the whole system gets sort of lose its empathy and understanding of what we need. That's what I feel.
Totally.
Even sometimes maybe it looks like we on purpose designs the system in the way that we make it impossible for people to get into the system. That's my point.
So it's more of a systemic design that's designing empathy out, and maybe actually that's a bit of what this quote actually reflects, rather than that the individual kind of empathy, but maybe that's part of what medical school is the systemic ways kind of designing it out by making people do residencies where they have round the clock shifts, and so that it's the system barriers and that lack of cohesion and access. So I think that's brilliant. Anna, what's your perspective on empathy in healthcare from your experience?
I totally agree with that, with the system perspective, that we have at times an overly bureaucratic system that has staff shortage, that has very long waiting times, and that doesn't really allow the healthcare personnel to take the time to be empathic. I do, however, think there's also on a personal level, I have been told by many doctors, for instance, that they cannot afford to be empathic because they see so many, incredibly touching cases, that if they would be empathic every time, they would have huge emotional problems and an emotional burden to carry. So they try to shut down this sort of this personal side a little bit and not let the emotions get to them, which kind of hinders them in that way to be empathic. And I think there is a very interesting discussion currently happening in a lot of healthcare systems on the use of digitalization in healthcare. So whether that makes it more or less empathic. And there is one hand that says, well, because of digitalization, we have less burdening on the healthcare system, so we are able to free up human resources because we can reduce the bureaucracy. On the other hand, we also have this moment where we say, well, digitalization makes it less human, it makes it less empathic because we are missing this human element. So I think in generally, people want to be empathic, but it is challenged by the given tensions that are at play that are often very paradoxical in nature.
Perfect. So I think, yeah, that presents kind of lays us a nice foundation for our conversation moving forward, this kind of systemic backdrop. And of course, people as an individuals maybe have that interest, but have certain kind of coping mechanisms to desensitize for all of the kind of work that they're doing. And that digitization, there's a lot of different trends that are kind of piling on this that are making kind of the empathy a little bit challenging. So I'd like to move now into just like a discussion broadly, and Anna, I'll ask you to kind of take this one a little bit, at least as a starting place, and then Tomas can react. So can you tell me a little bit about how you see the relationship between empathy and healthcare? And here in this academic paper, empathy is kind of defined based on the principle that a designer steps into the life of a user, wanders around for a while, and then steps out of the life of the user with a deeper understanding of the user. And you can see on the screen here is a picture of one of the Experiolab designers that has previously worked with Tomas, in touch with a caregiver, trying to find out about their experience by going on their daily walk. So can you tell me a little bit about how you see empathy?
Josina, I don't think the pictures are changing. We're still on slide number 1.
Well, that is less good. Okay, let's see here. Come back to, let me stop sharing, and then I will do it again. Let me just, sorry folks, that is a missed opportunity. Okay.
Well, digitalization happening, right?
Right. Is it taking away share? Okay, let's try. Can you see my screen again?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Oh,
and now, is it changing now?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was the lack of empathy in healthcare. I read the quote. You all commented brilliantly. Next slide. So here, this kind of empathy based on the principle designer steps into the life, wanders around, then steps out with a deeper understanding. Anna, how do you see the relationship between empathy and design?
So how we often see empathy is, and that relates to your quote, is like being in someone else's shoes for a moment in time. And empathy is shown to have very positive effects. So it supports this creative understanding, and it supports to generally to helps you to understand someone else. So for instance, you can have different role play examples, or you can, it's an initiative that we actually did together in Sweden when we role played being in a wheelchair in a hospital, and how that made us feel, where were some touch point issues. So it really helps you to take the perspective of another person. And it also helps you as part of a design team to integrate different perspectives. And it does so by not just having a brief touch point, like having a brief interview, but trying to, throughout the process, to integrate it. We will touch up on this later still. However, empathy has its limits. And it is integrating, in a sense, a second-hand perspective. So the question is, if you put yourself in a wheelchair in a hospital, can you really feel, can you really understand how this is for a person that will spend the rest of his or her life in a wheelchair? Can you really understand what it means that if you plan a holiday, that you need to think, how will you get on the transport mechanism? How will you get off it? How will you get around at your destination? Like, does that really help you understand this level of empathy, is how it really feels for someone else to be in those shoes? So there are the limits to empathy that we will kind of touch up on, I think, a little bit later still.
Yeah, great. So Tomas, from your perspective, you've defined early on in the kind of Experiolab philosophy, empathy as being something pretty core to Experiolab's way of working. Why is that? Why do you see it as something critical that design can bring to healthcare?
I'm thinking that design is always about creating, it doesn't matter if that's it's a service or a product or an artifact or an architecture or whatever it is that we design, we do that for the purpose of value creation and doing something in people's lives. So all design is about understanding what type of value it is that we want to achieve. And I'm thinking we all always sort of use empathy and curiosity about people's lives if we don't do that, if we don't head into any service innovation or any project that we do without starting to try and use empathy and curiosity to be able to understand what it is, the value and the situation, the value that we want to that the users want to have, then it won't be able to do any design, I think. So for me, it's absolutely core. If we don't use that, we will not be able to design anything that creates value in people's lives. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on something that's talked a lot about in kind of academic literature, that value is something that's determined by the person who the value is for, like the beneficiary or the user or the patient, so that somebody else can't fully determine that. So we have to be curious and empathetic to understand that if we're hoping to create value. I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so how does design kind of contribute to facilitating this kind of understanding of value? So I'll just read out this quote from a project that Tomas and his team at Experio Lab have been a part of, the first project at Experio. And then Tomas, I'll ask you to just elaborate on where something like this came from. Give us a bit of the project context of how this project has worked and facilitated empathy in this way. So this is a nurse that was involved in this project. She said, "We talked so nicely about patient-centered care and the patient in focus. It's very popular, but now suddenly we're supposed to see with the patient's eyes. How does it feel to lay there and count the dots on the ceiling, or see those lights passing by overhead without having any power over where I'm taken, for example? And it affects me directly in my daily work. All those things that came, large and small, it affected my work because afterwards, it wasn't so often about being able to stop for half a second and ask myself if it was so extremely important to put on that blood pressure cuff now, or could I let the patient breathe a few minutes, show where the toilets are, get a glass of water to create a positive situation and take in the patient's needs." So this seems like a bit of an empathetic shift from this sort of design project. Tell us a little bit about this and give us some context of how you work.
Well, like you said, this is one of maybe the earlier projects that we did. That doesn't really matter because we've done a lot like these ones after that. The context was, it was one of, just before we sort of opened Experio Lab, there had been another project around the treatment of stroke patients, where the healthcare organization wanted to map out everything that happened in the first year in a stroke patient's life to be able to do service innovation. And it was sort of obvious when that work had been done that in that process they had not involved patients of any kind. There hadn't even been interviews or anything. So this project was about to understand the patient's journey through the system from having, we specifically targeted elderly people, and we started in people's homes. So we wanted to understand the whole or healthcare system, wanted to understand sort of how does the whole journey from an accident through what happened in the municipality services through healthcare and back to the municipality services. And what we wanted to do was to really see it through the patient's eyes. So we did a journey like in three pieces, having sort of one, getting to hospital was the first piece. Within the hospital was the second piece, and then from hospital and back home was the third piece. And after sort of every pieced up journey, we during the journey we collected lots of information through pictures, photographs, interviews, involving the actual staff that were working in these wards or in these different settings that the patient passed through. So we get all of that information to really map out and understand how does it look through an eye of the patient. But what we also, heading into empathy, what we also wanted to explore was that a service is not only sort of the actual things that you see, it's also part of the, it has to do something with the culture of the organization, how a service is provided, and that's very obvious within healthcare. Of course, it's how we meet and how empathic we are, or how we meet patients. So and again, sort of what we thought before heading into this project, that person-centered care cannot only be what happened in sort of the front line. It also has to be, we should rather be looking for person-centered organization than just being person-centered in the actual meeting. And we thought, again, like we opened with, that had something to do with management of the organization and also the culture within the staff. So by making them role-playing this was of course not to, we're trying to get as close as the actual experience as possible. Of course, we can't really, we couldn't really operate on people's needs, of course, but as close as we could. And that was also to try and get to the culture on how people work. And I'm thinking, her name is Ulla, she's on the stretcher. The quote is from her. I know it sort of profoundly changed the way she worked. Unfortunately, she got so annoyed afterwards that she actually had to quit and go to another job. So she actually quit the organization because she felt she couldn't really use her empathic tools and meet the patients in the way she wanted to. Is that what you wanted, Josina?
Perfect. And perhaps that's also part of the culture change, people shifting to places that they can use their empathy in new ways. But you can see a kind of key transformation through engagement in a design project there, that there's some, that there's value to really embracing and helping people step out of their regular roles and contexts into embracing this. But then counter to this a little bit, Anna, you've been looking into some of the literature around empathy and also and some of the popular posting and things like this. And there's been some critiques and limits. So this blog post said the challenge with empathy is that people tend to focus on themselves. The other one says, popular design discourse is full of these articles and books and conference presentations on the role of empathy in design. But most designers argue the same thing, or most of them are arguing the same thing, that designers should attempt to build empathy for users. But then Tomas Edman is saying that empathy as generally practiced ultimately subverts its own goals. It tends to reinforce otherness, promote anthropocentrism, really kind of focus on human and not ignoring some of the more ecological considerations and things like that. Can you give us a glimpse into what are some of the limits of empathy and why does it matter to consider these things?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting to look at this side of empathy too. I think generally it is hailed a little bit like the holy grail in design, is that we design through empathy, which we do, which I fully stand behind, that we need empathy and also curiosity, as we talked about, in order to design. In my opinion, though, we need to be mindful of the limits of empathy. And if we look into literature, and some projects, what we find is what you mentioned, that it might lead actually to a single-mindedness. Even though you try to include others' perspectives, you might actually have a participation facade. So it's like sort of these tokenistic approaches to actually including others' perspectives. And that happens when you kind of have a set perspective on something and you have a set understanding. And when you try to take someone else's perspective, what you do unconsciously is that you reinforce your own perspective. And that's also why in the second quote, we have this reinforced otherness, because in the end, ironically, it might support designers to design for people like themselves in the end. And that in the end reinforces these colonial practices of design. So while empathy is absolutely key to the design process, it is important to acknowledge and to know the limits of it, that if we design only using a second-hand perspective, so without integrating a first-hand perspective, that we have to take really diligent care that we do not actually reinforce our own understanding and our own opinions, and only hear what we already sort of subconsciously think or subconsciously know, but that we really take care to allow for an objective integration of other people's perspectives.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So that gets that kind of a shift to thinking about how do we design for the future of empathy, that maybe some of our current practices need to be challenged a little bit and move. You can see in this picture here, Leah, who's the head researcher of the Service Design for Innovation network that we have all participated in, you know, putting on some of these empathy tools and experiencing what movement in the hospital is like. And that's, you know, a certain approach, but maybe there's other approaches that are evolving that we need to tap into in design. So just to kind of highlight that a little bit, Tomas, I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to this norm creative or norm critical, oh no, sorry, we're not, next one before that. So one Experial Lab project, just to kind of bring forward this issue in your context, Tomas, that I was talking with a couple of the project leaders of a project around electromagnetic therapy for people with severe mental health issues. And they were talking, they wanted to do this kind of patient journey project as well, where everybody walked through what it's like to get this therapy and better understand some of the stigma around it and what patients went through. But unfortunately, due to patients' current conditions and some of the stigma, they weren't actually able to get patients there. And then, as Anna was kind of suggesting, there was people started kind of projecting their own assumptions about how it was, and they actually had, you know, a little diary where people were kind of keeping track of what kind of emotions they expected at this point in time. And then realizing that these were just assumptions, one of the Experial Lab team went to actually interview some patients in their home and found some of them were actually too sick to be fully interviewed, couldn't remember everything. But then the ones that they got, they saw that actually their emotions through the journey were, you know, somewhat different than what these providers who did the role play actually expected. So, Tomas, what do you think something that the challenge in healthcare of actually doing these more empathetic approaches and getting in different folks, like how there's, you know, it's tight for people's time. How do you do this work and advance it in a meaningful way, recognizing that there are limitations and that we can't always have patients involved, or people don't have, you know, necessarily strong memories when they're quite vulnerable of the care that they're getting? Any reactions?
Wow, that was a big question, Josina. But as we are going through the pictures also, I'm thinking that when we talk about empathy, we could easily get stuck with that empathy tools is this thing where we role play or we put the designers in chairs. I can see one of my team members being in this chair here and in this picture. Whereas I think we try to look at on that as a broader thing than that. You have to build. It's hard work, I think, trying to understand how should we use empathy in every project. We understand we need it, but it's something more than just the role plays and putting like gadgets on people. What we often do with those kind of sort of the specific tools is that we use them early on in the project to get sort of and we don't only use it on the designers. We maybe use that for also the management team and others that are around the project, just to sort of create, maybe to spark that curiosity, to get them to get a little bit of a notion what this is all about. But then you have to add lots of other things to it. It's when you've done that, maybe it's easier to go out there and do your interviews or to engage with people and build other tools, because you just have had a little of an understanding on what the situation is. So I'm thinking empathy tools or working with empathy has to be a lot more than the things we have seen in the pictures. That's what I was thinking of.
Perfect.
It could be like one of these little things that happen in our work on the site, where one of we had this physician that was working in a hospital that had been involved in some of the projects. He suddenly called me one day and he said, "What do you know what I'm doing today?" So I have no idea what you're doing today. I'm thinking that when we send home elderly people to their homes, and we sort of, how do you say, you don't disregard. Discharge them from the hospital. We send them home with this list of medicines that they should be taking. Basically, we have no idea if they are able to, because we don't know what the situation is when they come home. So today I have made this little thing for myself on how to take notes and pictures, and I asked a couple of patients if I can just travel with them home to see what happened. So he did that, and then it took a couple of weeks, and then he called me again and said, "Hi, Thomas, you know what we'll be doing today?"
Oh, we're losing you a little, Thomas, if you hold it out again. Yeah.
Okay. And it took a couple of weeks, and then he called me again and said, "Thomas, do you know what I will be doing today?" So no, I have no idea what you were doing today. It's my day off, he said. So I went down to the hospital and I gave my little thing to other doctors, and then I took all the appointments they had and said, "Today you have to travel home with patients to see what happens when they come home, because it's going to make our work better to understand what people, how we do our medicine less, because we can do that." So for me, that is how you can be working with empathy also. It's something more than that. That was maybe not at all.
No, that's, yeah, I think, it's about advancing that beyond just designers too, which was the kind of first definition to act. And I think that speaks to the Experio philosophy actually combines empathy and curiosity, that there's a desire to challenge your own assumptions, not just only empathy, but it is actually that curiosity around what you don't know and things that goes with that. So we're kind of running out of time, but I just want to give people a glimpse into some of the alternative approaches and things. So just briefly, Tomas, can you tell us about norm critical and norm creative design approaches that are, Sweden has kind of pioneered this space, and it may be one response to traditional ways of empathizing only with the kind of normal patients or something in the hospital. Can you tell us a little bit about, just very briefly, what norm critical or norm creative design approaches are doing?
We talked about that a little bit from beforehand, Josina. I'm thinking I want to, because if people haven't understand, Josina has been a part of the team when she was doing her research. So I'm thinking actually you have a better voice on this than I do. I
can do it quick. So norm creative approaches is kind of emerging from the intersection of kind of gender studies movements in Sweden that have been quite strong, and challenging that it's not just gender that we need to critique and the norms around gender, but lots of our norms, and recognizing that the services and products that we're designing are often designing for norms, for, you know, what we consider to be normal, and that we need to actually actively go outside of that. So some of the Experio Lab projects that I think are absolutely brilliant are bringing forward kind of some of the stereotypes in the healthcare system, getting people to become aware of their own biases, who they think are difficult patients. Some of the work that's being done right now in the Stockholm Experio Lab is fascinating. And then this picture you see here is people putting on VR glasses to experience different healthcare worlds and react to what they kind of, how their experience is in that. So I will leave it there without going too much, but if you don't already know about norm critical design or norm creative design coming out of Sweden, I think it's a brilliant advancement, and Experio Lab is helping kind of pioneer that space. So I think it's super cool. Anna, can you tell us briefly about the work of patient innovation and maybe how leveraging lived experience could also be a response to some of this?
Sure. So I had the great opportunity to spend a couple of months at Patient Innovation, which is a non-profit platform for patients and their caregivers to share their innovations that they developed in response to their illnesses. Often these people are having rare diseases, or they having illnesses which are overlooked by bigger pharmaceutical companies because it's not such a profitable market. Or because maybe no one has actually thought about it. So to give you one example, while I was at Patient Innovation, I interviewed one of the patient innovators, and that was a very inspirational lady who has had, unfortunately, breast cancer. And after she had the surgeries in the hospital, she was discharged and she was told not to shower for 3 weeks. And you obviously you don't feel great. I cannot even imagine how she must have felt going through that. But then coming home, not being able to shower for 3 weeks because of the tubes that were allocated in the upper part, and that might have led to infections. And she tried to shower in garbage bags, as she found online. A lot of people do, but they obviously don't not completely shut around the upper part, so water can still get in, and she also got infections. And then at a later stage, she developed the shower shirt, so which is actually tight enough. It's a little bit like a diving suit, but on the upper part, so that no water can get in. And this has been for a lot of women a huge improvement during the recovery after these illnesses. So that is an example of a patient innovator who used her own lived experience, and lived experience is this very contextual, very situated knowledge of a situation, of a context, of an experience, and she used that to develop an innovation for herself. So lived experience in this sense is a very interesting concept that we also integrate in our design research, and which is kind of the balance to empathy in a way. So it is kind of those two function in a symbiotic relationship with each other. So lived experience is kind of this first-hand experience, and it works exceptionally well when you integrate it with the second-hand experience. So instead of role-playing, what some patients might go through, if possible, which is not always possible due to stigma, due to memory loss, due to the unavailability of patients, but if possible, if you can integrate patients that have gone through the experience in the design process, you get a much more situated and multifaceted understanding of the experiences, which helps to design better services and products.
Perfect. Thanks, Anna. And I think that speaks to some of Experia Lab's most recent projects also that are integrating a more kind of participatory approach, like the First Line project that's really bringing youth and their counselors together over a long period of time to really kind of co-design together.
And that's what I meant by saying so empathy is...
Oh, we can't hear you, Thomas. Try it. Yeah.
Why can't you hear?
There we, if you hold it there, you're okay.
Yeah, that's what I meant by saying so. Using empathy is more than those tools. That's just sort of the iceberg. In involving actual patients with lived experience, or some way, sometimes maybe recreating lived experience and in embedding that in the project is maybe the best way to build empathy into an innovation project process. I think so.
And
it's something more than just the tools.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Anna's speaking to around the symbiotic nature of them, that they feed each other. And that's really that lived experience that can help provide a check and balance for, is the empathy projection and how do they need to shift and those sorts of things. So we'll just finish up now, but quick shout out, Martina Caic will maybe present on a later session, but another thing to think about as we're thinking about kind of the future of empathy is the role of robots and technology and other things in facilitating or inhibiting some of the empathy. And Anna, you touched on this a little bit with digitization, but I think we will stop now so that we can take questions from the group. But this is definitely another kind of major influencing factor that's influencing kind of the future. So I think at the moment we'll just leave it here, and would love to hear from other people what they think should be invested in when designing the future of empathy in healthcare, or we can kind of leave this question if there's no other questions. Anna and Tomas, you can certainly answer that. But Payal, if you want to jump in, are there any questions in the chat?
I don't see anything. So if you want to just carry on with the previous slide,
Perfect.
I think that would be great. This has been super interesting.
So then let's get reactions to that. Maybe Anna, can you jump in first around how are you seeing kind of the role of robots and technology in relation to empathy in healthcare?
Yeah, so I think this is a very timely topic, especially given the current climate that we are facing at the moment. And I'm working with some colleagues on research on this, and what we have found in practical examples, excuse me, and in the literature is that it is kind of a little bit of a paradoxical relationship. So on the one hand, technology helps you free up resources. So a lot of doctors, a lot of healthcare personnel feels burdened by having, after the consultations, having to enter everything into a digital system, and a proper integrated technology system that is not just in silos, but in an actually integrated manner, would help them in order to free up more resources on their part. On the other hand, using technology, especially as part of consultations, some patients have stated that they feel like it brings or takes out this human element or this human touch of healthcare. Of healthcare consultations, and that it actually, while it makes it more efficient and effective also throughout consultations, it is kind of losing this human element. And I think this is especially an interesting topic to think about, because we are moving much more into this direction of virtual consultations now, so that you don't have to physically go to the doctor, but you can have a virtual consultation, as actually something that's happening right now in Germany. Because the doctors are so overburdened, they have started to take consultations over the phone, virtually only some, because we are not set up for that system yet, also legally. But I think this is a very interesting point, and I think it is now our responsibility as designers to design these interactions in a way that they are user-friendly, that they are human-centric, that they kind of take the patient and the ecosystem around the patient, meaning the family, the friends, partner, and take them all on a journey and on a holistic experience together. So I think should not just see the patient, but more this people-centric system, and think about enablers of actually making this experience human-centric, while also at the same time having it efficient and effective and also accurate from a technology perspective.
Yeah, thanks. I think that actually touches on some of what Martina gets at in her research too, that, you know, these robots or technology can be both inhibitors and enablers, and it depends on how we're designing them in relation to empathy, and that we need to not just look at it for an individual and that kind of patient, but actually for the wider system and how they're connected with that. So I think those are interesting. Tomas, what are your reflections? Robots, do they have any role to play? What are you thinking in relation to this?
Oh, I was thinking about something else, so I don't know. They are going to be playing a huge role, of course. But I was thinking about something else. It was maybe the question that wasn't on the last slide. That longer
jump there for sure.
Sort of more. Where do we need to invest? I'm thinking. Design is a capability that we all have, being that as a patient or as a designer or just as humans, we all design and do things. And we need, going back to empathy, we also need to understand, especially when we talk about person-centered care, we need to understand and realize that people have their own abilities and resources in creating health. So I'm thinking the next thing, which is sort of obvious now in the world situation that we have, it's not going to be healthcare that fixes this. It's going to be something else. It's in between systems, and it has definitely something to do with us. So a key thing that we've been aiming for, I think, in most of the Xperia work is trying to understand how do we design for resource integration? How do we make it easier for people, patients, or whatever you like to call them, to also be able to use their own resources in sustaining health or preventing illness, or of course, if you are in a specific situation, to be able to walk again after a knee operation or whatever it is. So I'm thinking that's what we need to have. Maybe we also need to rethink what healthcare does in our system to create health, because it's not only going to be healthcare that achieves this. And for me, that's pretty obvious when we look around us now. If we're gonna come through this Corona situation, it has to be a lot of other resources and systems, and definitely our own system, our own resources that is going to be needs to be integrated to get us through.
Yeah. So maybe in that way, it's what we should invest in is facilitating more of this broad collective empathy within communities rather than among healthcare personnel or in specific spots, that it's this, the capacity of everyone to do ongoing care and support their ongoing health and how they're integrating those resources. I think that's super interesting. So just in closing, I want to thank you both. I think you had some really interesting insights to spark. You've definitely sparked some thoughts in my head about how we can think about this differently, and hopefully some of the participants as well. But big thank you for sharing your expertise with us, and Payal for organizing, and Daniela as well, who's on this call.
Yeah, thank you so much, the three of you. This has been really insightful, and I'm sure it's been very helpful for all the participants as well. Like, I do have a lot of questions, and maybe I'm going to reach out to you separately. We'll be mindful of everyone's time right now. And I sincerely want to yes, I'm back on video. I sincerely want to thank all of you for this very, very insightful conversation. And there are like so many things that we are all seeing right now and we are all experiencing. So the challenge is really, how do we keep these conversations going, and how do we truly learn to empathize without having to experience it ourselves, and which I have kind of done in some ways. So how do we truly empathize with others, and move forward to a better future for humankind? So yeah, with that, I'll close this conversation, and we'll move to maybe an email chat. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all the participants for being here with us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.